Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. As you know, this is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factual and logically consistent. So, today we are going to be having a show, and essentially, the show is going to be talking about the Israeli Palestinian conflict. So, I've titled this show The Truth About the Nakba with Professor Robert Sherry. Professor Sherry is a professor emeritus at Brooklyn University, Brooklyn College. Um, Professor of economics. He has a PhD in economics from Kansas State University, which he received in 1968. And his main area of interest include race and gender earning disparities in America, issues of poverty, low income housing, tax reform to benefit working families, domestic relations, and immigration. And he's written extensively on the subject of discrimination and race, as well as the Holocaust in Poland. He's a member of the 1776 Unite. And he's written a whole lot of books and articles, which I find very, very interesting. I've had Professor Sherry in this show before, where we talked about race, we talked about affirmative action, and some other things, right? So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from that, but it still ties into it. But before we begin the conversation, Professor Sherry, I noticed something quite interesting in the email that you sent me, almost the concluding part of that email, and I just wanted to pick your thoughts on that. So you said this commitment to racial preferences has led the NFL at the Super Bowl to include a rendition of the Black national anthem alongside the national anthem. One more way the goal of a unifying nation is being undermined. So I want to understand what the sentiment is behind how this quote unquote Black national anthem, how it's a way to undermine unity in America. So I just wanted to get the thought behind that point.
Well, this was in the context of this month, as always, we celebrate Martin Luther King Day in the United States. And one of the signature visions that Martin Luther King had was this will become a colorblind country in terms of the way we interact with each other, both personally and legally, and in so we know that people have different races, different genders, different ethnicities, but when we interact with them in the public sector, in the business sector, we see them as individuals and judge them on their merit. And that's what America has always been about, at least in my mind, is that you can come from anywhere in the world, but you're an American once you're here and once you embrace uh, this kind of meritorious aspirations. And this has been a good country for immigrants from Africa, from Latin America, that if you look at all kinds of measures recently, these immigrant groups, it's not just the Asians, but other immigrant groups do well as long as they are following the kind of meritorious path. And there are problems that the black community, the sort of domestic, those who are uh, descendants of U.S. slavery, they they have been left behind for a variety of reasons. But you don't solve that by uh, making them an equivalent of the Star Spangled Banner. Uh, it just breeds a kind of separatist and a victimization, it derives from a kind of victimization mentality. So I, at the end of that email, I linked to an article I had in the Spectator about the meeting of Martin Luther King, and also was early Obama. Obama rose to power basically on Martin Luther King's rhetoric and values. He couldn't do that today. If he gave the speech he gave 20 years ago at the Democratic convention, he'd be booed off the stage. So there's been a real change in America, and that's what I was getting at. But let's move on.
Okay. Okay. All right. So thank you very much, Professor Sherry. So we don't waste time on that point, so it doesn't derail the conversation. So your article, the article that you wrote was historical myths of the Palestinian experience. I happened to go through the article, and there were a couple of interesting points there, and you linked some other articles, some other research work to buttress your point in the article that you made. So I want to sense that I have a sense that you have a pro-Israeli stance on the issue, on the conflict. Am I right to assume that?
Well, sure. I mean, look, nobody can feel good about the devastation that's going on in Gaza. Uh, you see some of these pictures and so on. Uh, but, there's a war going on, and there is a Hamas that I think is really responsible for what's going on. They could surrender and go into exile, and everything would be over. But they're still hiding out in their tunnels and throwing bombs when they have a chance. And so I I think it's unfortunate, but wars are unfortunate. What's going on in the Ukraine is a lot of dead bodies and buildings destroyed by both sides in some sense. So war, we're not used to a war where people fight for victory. We're used to wars, there's a little bit of gunfire, and then there's some kind of amnesty, some kind of an agreement. But we're not used to any more wars where there's a fight for unequivocal victory. And that's what's going on, unfortunately, in this situation. But again, my article wasn't about this war. It was about ideas that are embedded in people's minds about the context of this war. And as you mentioned, one of them is this concept of the Nakba. That you talk to anyone about the Nakba is about the displacement of 700,000 Palestinians during the 1948 war. If you read about the history of the term the Nakba, it had nothing to do with these refugees. If you listen to how Hamas talks about it, it has nothing to do with refugees. It had solely to do with the formation of a Jewish state in the midst of Arab lands. That was the Nakba.
Mm.
That when it would be memorialized uh, annually, when Nasser in 1956 had, a 1 hour silence in commemoration of the Nakba, it had nothing to do. He never mentioned anything about refugees. It was about the very nature of there being a Jewish state on Arab land. It only became an issue when Arafat got sort of cornered into a two-state solution possibility, and he had to come up with a reason to make sure it didn't happen. So all of a sudden, the Nakba became about the refugees, and unless Israel would take in the millions of descendants of these refugees, he wouldn't agree to a two-state solution. So it didn't have to do with the borders of the West Bank. It didn't have to do with Jewish settlements in the West Bank. It had to do with what are now 5 million official refugees. They're really descendants of refugees. I mean, after all, how many Palestinians in these refugee camps were born before 1948? Not
Okay,
very many. So you're
so
talking about descendants who have no relationship and people who don't, like in Lebanon, there's a couple of 100,000 refugees. They can't get Lebanese citizenship, even though they're born there, their parents, grandparents, all born in Lebanon. They can't get, they were highly restricted where they can live. They're highly restricted what kind of jobs they can get. So they're stuck in these refugee camps. Uh, anyway, I'm rambling on a bit, but
okay.
again, the Nakba
Mm.
has nothing, and there are issues about these refugees, which is also part of the myth. But the Nakba had nothing to do with these refugees.
Okay. So I think you may have gone ahead with some of the points I was going to raise later on, but we still have to start from where we have to start. So in one of the articles that you shared, right, there was this statement that says Jewish claims to territorial inheritance and to national sovereignty lay elsewhere in history rather than demography. So if I get the sense from that article is that the Palestinian claim to the land is that we are more in numbers. That's why this land is ours. And truthfully, in 1948, when the state of Israel was born, in terms of demographic, there were more Arabs in the land than there were Jews, right? But the Jewish claim is we have a history. We've been here for for far longer. We've this was our historical homeland. So the first question I would want to ask is, what does it mean to be Jewish, right? Is it a religion? Is it an ethnicity? Because we have the Ashkenazi Jews, we have the Mizrahi Jews, we have the Hasidic Jews, we have the Sephardic Jews. And if you look at these people, there are
You have Ethiopian Jews.
you have Ethiopian Jews. So they are more akin to the ethnicities they live within. For example, the Mizrahi Jews will look Arab, right? The Ethiopian Jews will look Ethiopian. The Ashkenazi Jews will look European, right? So what
The
what
majority of Israelis are non white. They're either Mizrahi Jews, Ethiopian Jews. They are not Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi
okay,
Jews are maybe 30% of Israel, of the
but
Jewish population.
that's a secondary point, right? Because like the point you just made that oh, the Palestinians are born, those Palestinians who are born in Lebanon should be Lebanese citizens, right? The Jews who are in Ethiopia, who came from Ethiopia, they are Ethiopians. They should be Ethiopian citizens. The Jews who came from Iraq, from Iran and other parts of the Middle East, what right, what claim do they have to Palestine when they are from a place called Iraq, where they are from a place, they are from Poland, they are from Germany, they are from some of these other
Exactly.
places. What
So,
claim do they have to the land of Palestine? So
well,
we need to start with what is a Jew. We need to
exactly.
let us try and get that
That's
relationship.
where you get into this colonial settler vision of the Jewish enterprise in Palestine. Now, the first thing is there wasn't a Palestine until 1920. Under the Ottoman Empire, there was no area that was called Palestine. There were no Arabs that considered themselves Palestinian. They were Arabs. It ended up there were also a significant Jewish population from at least the Middle Ages in Israel. The majority of the people in Jerusalem, for example, in the mid 19th century, before the Zionist immigration, the majority were Jewish. So there has, it's not simply biblical times that Jews were there, but throughout history, there's been a significant Jewish presence in what became Palestine. Again, until 1920, There was no Palestine. Now, in terms of the Arab population, it ends up in the Jewish area, the area that became the state of Israel. A significant number of those Arabs who ultimately were became refugees had only lived in that area for one or two generations. They had migrated from what is now the West Bank because of economic reasons. So that, you know, I mean, part of the Arab, the issue of the Arab population in the 1920s, half of the Arab population was landless. They either worked as agricultural laborers or they worked as sharecroppers. They didn't own the land, and often, as I mentioned, migrated to the coastal area, to Haifa, to Jaffa, to seek employment. So this idea that there are these deeply rooted Arab descendants who have deep roots, they own land, they were there for generations, that's just not true. Yes, they were there, they were in the West Bank, but they were not in the part that became Israel to, uh, I would estimate probably 30 to 40% at least were not in in the Jewish area for more than two generations.
Uh,
So so you have a transient population much more than this vision of the Palestinians being deeply rooted in in Israel in in Israel, and it's this Jewish colonial settlers that dispossess them from
okay,
their
sir.
historic roots.
So a couple of things, right? So the first point, which I think we should still come back to, is we have to define what is a Jew, what does it mean to be Jewish, right? I don't think anyone debates that Jews have always been in the area called Palestine, right? From historical analysis, Jews have always been there. They had a kingdom. They had the kingdom of Israel thousands of years ago. It was destroyed. The ten tribes of Israel were destroyed, leaving the two tribes of Judah, Israel and Benjamin and Judah, right?
You're going
The
into the
Romans,
Bible here.
yeah. So the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD, and a lot of the Jews were um, they were exiled, right? But if you even go throughout the Crusades, if you go through the periods of the Crusades, whenever the Christian Crusaders came into the Palestine or whatever it was called then, they always met Jews and they slaughtered Jews. So it was never the case that the land was absent Jews at any point in time, right?
That's right.
Jews have always been there, right? So now, as at the time the state of Israel was formed in 1948, Jews were a minority in that. In those who identified as Jews were a minority. Um, it's
In the
it's also
overall, they were a slight majority in the area that was designated to become Israel. There was a
well that's
partition. No, there was a partition.
there was a partition that gave 67% of the land to Jews when if
Well,
you
that
took the total area
67%, I
together,
know, I understand. The
Israel was
67%
less than Jews were
is a
less
tricky
than.
number because it included all of the Negev where no one lived.
Yeah, but it's still
So
land.
I understand, but but if you look at, anyway, go on.
Okay, so now my point is Jews have always been there. No one disputes that. My point now is what gives the right to an Ashkenazi Jew whose quote and unquote has ancestors have not been in that land for 2,000 years, right? What gives them the right to that land? What gives the Iraqi Jew whose ancestors may probably have never been there for the last 1,000 years? What gives them the right to that land? What gives the Ethiopian Jew whose ancestors who have not been in that land for maybe 1,300 years? What gives them more right to that land than, say, the Palestinians or the Arabs who had whose ancestors were there 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago. So that's the point where I'm coming from, right?
No, no, I
Why are
understand. I understand that one can have position that while Israel became a refuge for Jews, after all, there were 800,000 Jews from Arab countries that were dispelled in the early 50s.
as a response to this formation of the
No,
state
it
of
was
Israel?
even before. So, for example, um, the head of the Palestinian was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He, in the 1920s and the 1930s, uh, organized pogroms of Jewish areas in Palestine. He then led a revolt against the British and was expelled. He goes to Iraq and organizes pogroms against Jews in 1940 and organizes a coup for a Nazi allied government in 1941. The British overthrows that rump government. So he goes to Germany and becomes a mouthpiece for Hitler. After the war, he comes back and is made head of the Palestinian organization within the Arab League. So this is the kind of so the idea that Jews were just dispelled from Iraq or from Tunisia, from Algeria, and elsewhere because of the state of Israel is just not true. That there was fomenting against Jews in these countries well before the Second World War. And if there wasn't a state of Israel, there'd be no place for them to go.
Okay.
So, yes, there were 700,000 Palestinians who were displaced, but there were an equal number of Jews from Arab countries who were displaced. And, that's after the Second World War, there was a million Germans who lived in Poland and the Ukraine and Czechoslovakia who were kicked out. They were sent back to Germany. You know, there after the First World War, there was Greeks and Turks who had to leave and go. There was the same thing with Pakistan and India. That there were. I'm not saying it it was fair or right, but the reality was this was a period of time where there was it was not seen it was not considered unethical to transfer ethnic groups after wars. And again, here we're talking about a Palestinian population that itself was transient to a large degree. It wasn't like it lost its home for, you know, generations after generations. We own that farm and we so on and so on. So it's not fair, but after wars, people have to recreate new lives. That's what they have to do and move on. And the Palestinians don't move on. So they're sitting in Gaza, they're sitting in Lebanon, and what they're told is don't you keep sitting there, we'll take over Israel and you'll be able to return there. It's a
Okay.
bizarre situation that we have now. And I don't want to, and you can understand when you have a Palestinian leadership that's pro-Nazi, the Grand Mufti, the head of the one of the interesting things is for the first 6 months of the war, before there was the invasion of Jordanian and Syrian and Iraqi and Egyptian troops, before they invaded, there was an internal war between Arab forces and Jewish forces. The Arab forces were supposed to be indigenous Palestinians, but it was 90% foreign volunteers. That the Palestinian people in Israel didn't fight against the state of Israel. They they were pawns in this struggle of the Arab powers that wanted to squelch this country. And that's why there was never a Palestinian government of any kind, because there was no Palestinian nationalism until the 1960s and 70s.
Mm.
There wasn't any Palestine. And so you have a very bizarre situation where a war is created by foreign powers, not by the indigenous Palestinian people. You know, you had the Grand Mufti and a few others, but you didn't have an indigenous Palestinian movement. And at every point, the Jews were willing to settle for a much smaller area than they actually got. But once there was a war, they basically said, we're going to win. And they were forced into that. And it's unfortunate. Uh, but this idea that there was some Palestinian national consciousness of people who lived there for generations is just fairy tale.
Okay, before I circle back to this point, to almost the
Okay.
last point you made, so this last point that you just made, I think it's tragic that the Palestinians are victims of things that are not of their own making. I mean, you said that there were pawns in this
Yes,
struggle by other
by the
Arab
Arab
nations,
nations.
of other nations, right? They were also victims of the fact that Jews were victimized in Europe and other parts of the world, right?
That's right. They
So part of this is a two-part question. The first part question would be, why should the Palestinians who never created a popular uprising against the Jews, why should they have to suffer for the actions of other Arabs and the actions of anti-Semitic Europeans? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, if you look at the formation of the state of Israel, Theodor Herzl, who is the spiritual founder of the State of Israel, he said something. He said that Jews all over the world, that they are as different from each other, and that the only thing that binds them together is this consistent persecution by other forces, by the people they live amongst. That on the day they find themselves in the same land, they might find that they are just as different as a Russian is from a Pole, from a German, and all that. So there wasn't even really a cohesive Jewish national identity
that's not
prior prior to
let's do
the
these two
advent of
things.
Zionism.
The one is, why should the Palestinians have suffered from everyone? Uh, and then I'll get to this issue of Jewish unity or not. You're absolutely right that the circumstances of the persecution of Jews in the Second World War and what to do, there were, you know, 300,000 or 400,000 Jews in refugee camps in Germany after the war, and nobody wanted them. And they weren't going back to Poland or where they came from, where they were persecuted. I I did a book on Poland and the Holocaust. And when Jews tried to come back after and we're talking about a very small number of Jews tried to come back to towns, The people didn't want them back. The people had taken over their homes, their businesses, and so on. And there were pogroms in Poland in 1946. So where can they go now? Why should it, why should the Palestinians have to deal with that, right? But it was a reality. And as I mentioned, the Jews from the Arab countries, these Mizrahi Jews in Iraq, they were there for 2,500 years in Iraq. They were an important community in Iraq. Poof, because of this anti-Semitism. Where do they go? So it it's unfortunate, but the point is, this is not the image of colonial settlers. It's not like South Africa. It's not like Australia. It's not like the US, where people voluntarily go to a place and take it over. These were refugees who wanted to live side by side. And they didn't, when they came in, they didn't have political power. They didn't, they weren't able to subjugate the Palestinians in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. They just needed a place to be. And so, yes, the, the Palestinians have a gripe and a concern, but this kind of settler colonial rhetoric is incredibly misplaced. Now, as I mentioned, we're at a time now where what kind of solution is there for these refugees, whether they're in Gaza, they're in Lebanon, uh, there are still some in Syria, Jordan. I think there's been all kinds of funding that says we can help you build new lives. And it's been resisted by the Palestinian authorities because they don't want to give up this right of return of refugees. That's what's holding up a lot of the dynamics. Is if there was a two-state solution where in the West Bank there'd be a Palestinian state, what's that going to do for these refugees in Gaza and Lebanon? They could go there now if they wanted. So you have a situation where there's there's all kinds of funding that would be available to help transition to new lives of people where they live, or if they want to move somewhere and they can get visa. I mean, that's what has to be done, is to construct lives for these people, and which has nothing to do with them coming to Israel proper. They've never lived there. There's vague family memories of anyone who lived there. They were poor, landless peasants. You know, the idea that they have to be able to come back to this with the state of Israel is unreasonable. And it's holding up finding ways for them to transition and their families to better lives in better situations than sitting in refugee camps.
So my question would be, why didn't the Jews? I mean, the Jews could as well find a place in Europe and say, let's make the most of the situation that we find
They
ourselves
couldn't.
in.
There was rampant anti-Semitism. That's the whole
Yeah,
thing.
well,
That
that's
nobody
Europe's
they would have
fault.
gone they would have gone to the United States if the United States would have let them. They had rampant anti-Semitism. So there was no place, and they're sitting in these refugee camps in Germany, 400,000 of them. They're sitting there, and the only place that they could go was to Palestine. It's not
So
fair.
so the issue with sort of this narrative, the issue I take with this narrative is that the Zionist project preceded the Second World War. There had been moves prior to the Second World War, for Jews to return to Palestine. Jews were returning, so much so that the British had to limit Jewish migration to Palestine because the local Arabs were,
Didn't like
they
it.
were antsy. Yeah, they didn't like it. They were
We have
antsy about it
these.
because they suspected, they knew they suspected the intentions of the Zionists, right? And the Zionists made it clear that they wanted to colonize that. It's very replete in the writings of
Yeah, but I mean, if you
Theodor
go,
Herzl,
I
right?
understand, but again, it's people who are fleeing persecution.
Yeah, they're fleeing persecution, and then they're going to create persecution where
They're
they're
not,
fleeing
but they
to.
didn't go there to persecute anyone. They went there to live.
They went there to live, to create a state without taking
And
into
for
consideration that
example,
there are local peoples who might not want.
In 1937, there was a Peel Commission, British Peel Commission, and what they recommended was that there'd be a Jewish state on 10 to 15% of Palestine. 10 to 15 in very select areas, and the Jews were willing to agree to it. But the Palestinians said, no, we're not going to allow any Jewish state. There were issues of binationalism, having where each group, sort of like Switzerland, where there were kind of cantons and you'd have some integration. The Arabs were against it. They were against anything that would give any recognition to Jews being in the land. So, yes, there were certainly stronger Zionist aspirations than that. But the reality was, at every step, there was a compromise that the Jewish leadership was willing to accept. And it kept being turned down. I mean, ultimately, the state of Israel was bigger than the partition that the UN set up in 1948 and 47. But at every step, because as the image of the Nakba, the very nature of having Jews as equals was anathema to the Arab world. Oh, Jews could live in Iraq, they could live here, but as second class, said they didn't have
Yeah,
full
but
rights.
that's a different. I think that's a different conversation, right? We can go into that and talk about how
No, no,
unfair
but
it is that
it's
Jews
these
have to
as
live as
I
second-class
indicated,
citizens.
it really was the Arab League that dictated the outcome of these rejections. That there really wasn't an indigenous Palestinian movement or organizations. They had barely any newspapers. There wasn't, it was really the Arab League that had control over the dynamics. And that's why the Palestinians were pawns. You know, they didn't have any say in any of this. Uh, and in fact, it ended up that one of the reasons that the Jews were successful in the war was that the Grand Mufti had alienated Palestinians for a variety of reasons. He was autocratic, he killed some of his opposition, and so there were a lot of collaborators, an awful lot of collaborators during the war of Palestinians. They worked much more with the Jews than they did with the Arab League or the Arab armies because of dynamics like that. So
But that's ironic. If the Palestinians were more on the side of the Jews, then it's ironic that they were sacked from their villages and they've not been allowed to return.
no, no, I understand. I'm not saying that the well, I'm not saying the Jews treated them and what happened after the war with land acquisition from 49 through 1960 was to some degree, to a very large degree, indefensible what happened. So the Jewish experience of how they conducted the war, what they did after the war has more than so small faults to it. But well, let's leave it there. Okay.
Okay. So let's talk about you know let's talk about the current crisis, right? Um, Talking about the claims that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, and the counterclaim that, oh no, it's not genocide. So far, Israel has killed upwards of 25,000 people within the space of a couple of months. Many of them
If
civilians.
you take the numbers from Hamas as
Well,
correct,
yes, if we take even if we don't, even if that number
but
is
even if it's half that, it's
even
still a lot of
yes, even
people.
if exactly, even if it's half that, it's still a lot of people. And there are many people who are arguing that, oh, it's not a genocide because, if Israel had the power, Israel has the power. If it wanted to commit genocide, it could literally do that. But we could easily have said that Nazi Germany had the power. If it wanted to kill every Jew at once within its territory, it could have done that.
No,
But
no,
it
but
did it,
let's go into
it did it,
this.
it did
Let's
it
go
with,
into these deaths. These deaths, it's one. You can go throughout the Middle East where in many of the recent wars, 10 to 20,000 people getting killed is no big deal.
20,000 people being
It's
killed is
not in the
1%
middle.
of
In
Gaza's
Syria, how
population.
many do you think were killed in Syria? How
I
many do
mean,
you think were killed in Iraq? How many?
20, 20,000 people dead is 1% of the population of Gaza.
Yes, it's 1%. I don't know how that's genocide, but that's 1%. We use a.
So imagine if 1% of a country like India is killed, or 1% of a country like the United States is
No, I
killed.
know it's not insignificant at all. But don't forget that this is a war where Hamas embeds itself in civilian areas. It builds bunkers under civilians, under hospitals. I mean, you've seen all the pictures. I don't, and I think Israel has certainly made significant efforts, could have made more maybe, but they've certainly made significant efforts to avoid killing civilians. They leaflet areas, they get people to move out, they they do any number of things where if they simply wanted to kill people, they could have done a much better job. So, this is an urban war where Hamas consciously embeds itself in civilian areas, in schools, in hospitals. And,
But
Israel has
but
decided,
don't you think that that is because of the asymmetry in power between both forces? I mean, the Palestinians are going to use to their advantage because they are not as strong as Israel, right? And if you look at Israel itself, I bet you would find military infrastructure embedded within civilian areas. It's not as if all the military infrastructure as it's a secluded
I know,
area, and
but really,
civilian centers are at a secluded area,
now,
right?
let me
No,
just
this is
ask
not.
you,
I'm
yeah,
not
but the
making brief
problem
for
is,
Hamas anyway, but
the
I'm saying
problem,
that
yeah,
I'm
I'm
saying
just
that
saying that these killings, first of all, if you take Israel's numbers as correct, how many Hamas fighters they've killed, then at least a third of the numbers are combatants. That, after all, uh, the numbers you have don't distinguish between combatants and civilians. They're total numbers.
but how
So,
do I trust those numbers by Israel? Because one,
oh, you trust
Israel.
Hamas's numbers?
No, no, I'm not saying I trust any, but I'm saying why should I trust Israel's number any more than I trust Hamas? Because now, sir, listen, this is why I'm saying this. One, Israel is not carrying out a special military operation where it's going in with troops and is fighting Hamas fighters and killing them, right? Knowing that, oh, these are combatants. It's bombing areas, right? And many of these deaths are from bombing areas. Now we could say, well, those areas are places where Hamas fighters are, where they are congregating or they are hiding. But given the fact that Israel pre-warns people, we're going to bomb this place, right? Isn't it logical that Hamas would simply remove itself from those
Well, it's
centers
not so
before
easy
the
for her.
bombs drop?
First of all, it isn't like they give them 2 days to get out. They give them an hour or two to get
An
out.
hour or two. So both civilians and so
No, but the point is,
how
see what I am concerned about is here you have Hamas that's been brutalizing Gaza for 18 years. It has no independent journalism, has no independent judiciary, has no right of dissent, has very restrictive rules on women, on certainly gays and lesbians. The idea that there are queers for Hamas is bizarre. So here you have a very brutal regime that we now see has taken aid money that could have built Gaza, and they built these elaborate underground tunnels with millions upon millions of dollars and manpower. So here you got this brutal organization, brutal to its own people, indifferent to their plight. And nobody has said to me, if Israel gets out, is Hamas going to be replaced?
okay,
And
so
that's the thing here, that if if you're willing to say, well, Hamas was elected 18 years ago, they represent the people, we're going to rebuild Gaza, and they're going to be the head of it, that's what Israel won't accept. So unless the international community makes very clear that Hamas will have no part in the governance and the rebuilding of Gaza, unless they make that clear, I don't think Israel has any choice but to do what they do, and they should do it maybe a little bit better. But for people to avoid the issue of Hamas and Gaza afterwards, and to not be critical of Hamas's rule over Gaza and what it has done to those people and how it has misused resources because of its war aim. I think that's, if people can answer that, then I certainly would hope that Israel would withdraw. But as long as people just say permanent ceasefire and have nothing to say about who's going to be ruling Gaza afterwards, who's going to be with the aid money, these UN schools are abusive. I mean, in what they teach and how they're employment vehicles for Hamas people. Unless that stuff is changed, I don't think Israel has much of a choice but to continue this. I mean, what do you think should happen with Gaza if Israel pulls out?
okay, so first, I want to agree that Hamas is a problem. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas's um, tactics and whatever they're doing is terrible. Hamas is an oppressive regime, right? Oppressing the
Yeah,
people of Gaza. But that is a secondary issue, right? First of
that's
all,
what Israel is fighting.
so I'll get to my point. That's a secondary issue, right? I think the people of Gaza have a right to decide what form of government they want. So if they want an ultra nationalist Islamist government, good for them. That's their business. Let them get to deal with that. Hamas, however, is a symptom of a larger problem, which is the occupation of West Bank and Gaza of Palestinian lands. Hamas was born in 2006. Prior to 2006, there was no Hamas. Yet there was no peace solution. The occupation was not lifted. They were still occupying the West Bank and Gaza.
Hamas
And
started
even
earlier than that.
currently,
It
yeah,
didn't
but
have power in 2006. It started
they
in
are
the
terrorists. They are
1980s.
their terrorist activities started very, very recently, right? And there is no Hamas in the West Bank, right? But the West Bank is still under occupation. I've seen videos of how the West Bank is being ruled. I mean, every point is literally manned by Israeli security operatives, where people are like, you can't go out, you can't come in without the checks of an Israeli army officer, right? And then there are settlements. Israel keeps expanding its settlements into the West Bank. There are about
They don't. First
112
of all, let me just say
Israeli
something about
settlements.
the settlements. There's been exactly 3 new approved settlements in the last 25 years that represent 2% of the settler population. There has been a doubling of the settler population, but it's been natural growth rates in already existing and not expanding settlements. So, this idea that the settlers now, and the idea that Hamas is not in the West Bank was true up until about a few years ago. Hamas made a conscious effort 2 years ago to go to the West Bank and start creating conflict in Jenin and others. And so all of a sudden, in the last 2 years, there's been an uptick of interaction. Now, how the Israelis handle it, I'm not going to defend. In particular, these fascist uh, group of settlers. Not all settlers, but there certainly are a group of settlers who are fascist, and they are being encouraged by the right wing of the Netanyahu government. So I'm much more concerned about that in many ways.
Mm,
But and the idea of this occupation is a bit tricky. Before this uptick in the last 18 months, 2 years, there was very little incursion of Israelis in the area that was controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Where you had issues was at checkpoints. If you wanted to leave this Palestinian area and go to another Palestinian area, but the bottom line is there could be a settlement of this issue if there was not the right of return. There could be a settlement, and it's a little tricky because the Palestinian Authority has no credibility in the West Bank. You got this 88-year-old Abbas who was elected 20 years ago to a 4-year term. So it's not as if there's any reliable force that you could say there's going to be stability in the West Bank if Israel just pulled out. They pulled out of Gaza and Hamas came in. So I I'm very worried about what's going on in the West Bank because of these fascists and how they're stirring up stuff and it could filter. One of the things you don't see in this is the Arab population of Israel. There are 2 million Arabs living in Israel proper now. You haven't seen any demonstrations. You've seen support. You've seen public support by the leaders of the Arab community in Israel for at least during the first month of this incursion. You should think
But
about that. Why Arabs in
that's
the state of Israel are supporting the government?
that's to be expected.
Why?
They
They're
have
Arab.
they
They didn't do it. They didn't do
y-
it
y-
when
y-
when there was the war in Gaza three
so
years
I'll tell
ago.
you why, sir.
When
I'll
there was
tell
a
you
war
why.
in Gaza, there was uprisings in Jewish mixed cities. There was
I'll tell you why they didn't do that, right? They didn't do it because they have what every other Palestinian is fighting for, a state with equal rights and protection. So why would they want to fuck that up? Why would they want
that's
to
exactly right.
mind my language? Why would they?
That within Israel,
They
you should
have
say
what
that
other Palestinians
you
are
should say that
fighting for.
10 times, that within the state of Israel, Arab citizens, they don't have equal rights, but they have pretty close to equal rights. And they have education, they have health,
They have
they have a good
citizenship. They
life.
have a yeah.
They
They
have a
have
good
a
life.
state, which is what
So,
the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank want. So it would make no sense. It will almost seem as if the Arabs are uh, genetically defective to for those inside
yeah,
Israel
but
are
as I
enjoying
said,
those rights to now fight Israel because of that. No, they
but they've
they're
never
going to
had a
protect.
leadership. Even, the PA, they've never had a leadership that was about building a country. What kind of economy was built in Gaza? What kind of an economy is built on the West Bank? That's not what their leaders, that's not what the PA or Hamas are about. They're not about building, because if you build an economy where people are content, you can't continue the struggle. And that's what's been unfortunate, is that they've had leadership that are not interested in building better lives. They're interested in continuing the struggle for a one state solution. And I mean, it's unfortunate that the Palestinians keep getting victimized in
But
this.
what's so terrifying about a one state solution? I mean, Israel already has 2 million Arabs who are behaving very well. So what's so terrible about there being one state with equal rights for all, both
Because
Arab and Jew?
there's been no evidence from either Gaza or the West Bank that the Palestinian leadership and the organizations there are interested in equal rights. They've never enunciated it. And first of all, supposedly the PA says it wants a two-state solution. So, I mean, I could see over time that a, an independent West Bank might merge or have economic relationships, stronger ties with Israel. But I think that the whole history means that there'll have to be a transition to something like that, where there's evidence of goodwill, and we're not there yet. But again, I'm I'm sort of struck by that there's an unwillingness to say that Hamas should not be allowed to rule. You say, well, it's up to the people of Gaza, right? That's what you said. It's up to the people. Uh, I think that if it's up to the people, who knows? There may be a majority who still want Hamas. Now, there have been demonstrations of sorts in Gaza of Gazans saying Hamas should leave,
Yeah.
but who knows?
So if you see Hamas, everything is strategic, everything is political, right? Hamas coming into power because um, they they wrongly took credit for Israel pulling out of Gaza. That was a unilateral move, which was a very terrible thing for Israel to do. Hamas took
And they had
advantage of that.
social welfare institutions.
Yeah,
They had a
they took
certain infrastructure that gave people a positive view of them.
yeah. So they took advantage of that to become this symbol of the resistance movement to Israel, right? In a way, in a way, saying that violence would get them results because they resisted and Israel pulled out of Gaza, which was for a totally different reason. Israel did not pull out because they were afraid of Hamas and all that. It was for demographic issues. So Hamas is the symptom of a bigger, larger problem. There hasn't been an election in Gaza for about what, 2 decades, right? So there's not even an option for the people of Gaza to say we don't want Hamas anymore. These guys are authoritarians. Authoritarians never leave unless they are forced out. So it's not a thing of the people of Gaza choose these people to be their leaders. But even if they did, the only problem I have with Hamas would be Hamas's attacks on Israel, which still has, there's a historical basis for that.
Oh, you don't have
If
any problems
Hamas
with how they ruled internally for the last 18
I
years?
I have personally I have issues with that, but I don't think it's my business. I don't think it's anyone's business how they choose to rule within the territory that they control. If they want to be autocratic, well, that's their thing to deal with, right? I don't think any country should prescribe for any other country how to rule their people, right? So I have issues with the sort of attacks that they have been launching against Israel. That's as far as I can say about that, because
Okay,
governments do
okay.
whatever they want to do. There are some people who want to live under authoritarian regimes. Afghanistan is one. That's their business, right? So, but the thing is, Israel is in itself, in a way, a part of the problem in terms of not finding a resolution to this problem. Even the Netanyahu government has been sort of very vocal about them not wanting a two-state solution. I think the Oslo Accords was actually a path to creating a two-state based on the 1967 borders, which Israel does not want. And I think there are a lot of Palestinians who are open to a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders, which Netanyahu and his government doesn't want at all. Netanyahu has gone to the UN with a map of the whole of Palestine and Israel and saying from the river to the sea, this is the land of Israel, right? So where does he want the 6 million Palestinians to go to? He doesn't want to grant them citizenship, yet he wants to take over the whole of the land.
He
Uh,
doesn't want to, no, this idea that he wants to take over the whole of the land. There's
but
certainly, there's certainly, if he wanted to do that, for example, he would have had a much more aggressive settlement project over the last 20 years. And yet, as I mentioned, only three new approved settlements in the last 25 years. That
but there are there
that
are there
says
are
to me
100
much more.
illegal
What?
there are 100 illegal settlements, and the Israeli
Yeah,
government
but
isn't
they
doing
have
anything
30,
about it.
50 people, and every once in a while they're torn down and they go up. But the point is, if he wanted, if he wanted to take over the West Bank, he would have had tens of approved new settlements in the West Bank, hundreds of new approved settlements in the West. That's how you take it over. That's how they took over the That's what they wanted to do in the Galilee in the 1960s. They wanted more Jewish settlements in the Galilee because they didn't want an area that was totally Arab. They put up 30, 40 new settlements in the Galilee. So the idea that somehow he wants to take over the West Bank, but he's not approving any new settlements, doesn't seem to square at
Because he's a
all.
politician and politicians always look at optics, right? Yes,
Yeah,
the
but if he
official
wants to
policy of
take
the
it
government.
over, he looks at optics. What he looks at is there's certainly a Masonic group within Israel among the settlers, not all, not most. Most of the settlers commute to Jerusalem. They're within a half hour, 20 minutes of Jerusalem, and they commute for work. But there are these messianic bunch who are now part of his government. Never before were they part of his government. And that's what the danger is. They want to go resettle Gaza. You know, there are there are dangerous people who he's given some room to do stuff. But that's not Netanyahu. Netanyahu will say things to get elected. So why, like like I've written a number of things about. On the one hand, Netanyahu during elections is incredibly racist about Arabs. On the other hand, his government has done much more aggressive affirmative action for Arabs than anywhere else in the world in some ways, where 30% of salaries for 2 years, industrial parks, school. There's been a whole range. This equality that exists in Israel for Arabs is under his 20-year rule. So you have to, he's like Nixon was in the US. Nixon, on the one hand, during election years, was an incredible racist. But when you look at his policies towards black Americans, it was pretty liberal. So you have to be careful in distinguishing between a certain kind of rhetoric that keeps in the fold for at election time this this tale of racist and what Netanyahu's governments have consistently done. And that's why he never built or approved new settlements in the West Bank.
But
That's not what he's about.
but
And
but he wouldn't. Netanyahu's strategy, it seems to me, is to um, create a problem that he can deal with force. Settlements will not do that, right? But strengthening Hamas, if there's a terrorist, or if there is a radical element within the Palestinian areas, then it gives him justification to do what he wants to do, just as he's doing right now in Gaza, right? There have
you
been
think
reports
he likes
about
what
the
he's doing
Netanyahu.
now? You think he
There's been
likes
repo- there have been reports about the Netanyahu government giving support to Hamas, right? And
what
there was a
what that
clip
support
there.
was is he allowed Qatar to give money to Hamas. That's what he allowed to do, is to allow Qatar to give money. And he thought it would buy off Hamas. It's quite clear that he totally underestimated Hamas's seriousness of pursuing the destruction of Israel. There's no question he underestimated. And when there's the next election, he's gone.
But why did he oppose the Oslo Accords? I mean, it was people in his.
I don't know what you're saying opposed. There was, there were, what happened was that there were, he doesn't trust the Palestinians. But two, there were all kinds of, under labor governments, attempts, and Arafat and then Abbas would never put forward a meaningful proposal. They would just say, we don't like your proposal. We don't like your proposal. We don't like this map. And it was all about the right of return. They can't give that up. They got these people sitting in refugee camps. And what are you going to tell them if you give up the right of return? Oh, we just had to make this deal, right? But meanwhile, for 3 generations, they're sitting in refugee camps. So that's what's holding up a settlement, is they don't know what to do about these intergenerational families sitting in refugee camps waiting to go back to Israel. If you give up the right of return, you're you're telling people we you get killed. Any Arab leader who said we're not going to we'll have a two states without a right of return, he'll be dead in a week.
Wow. Well, Professor Sherry,
You
it's
don't think
been
so? You think you think these people who've
it's.
been sitting in Gaza and Lebanon, you think going to say, "Oh well, he had to make that deal"?
I think there is a settlement. There is a sentiment amongst, it's always the radical elements who have the loudest,
Yes, that's true.
make the loudest noise in any population. I have a sense that the majority of Palestinians are weary, they're tired. They just want to have a state, they want rights, they want to be treated as human beings and not to be under occupation. Yeah, we can say there are radical elements who wouldn't want that because they want it for political purposes, they want power, but that doesn't represent the most of the Palestinian
Yeah,
people.
but
And I
let's finish
think
it up.
if
Let's just finish it up. I mean, but it but if there was an independent West Bank and an independent Gaza, that would mean these people are stuck where they're living. The people in Lebanon, they don't want to go to the West Bank, the Palestinians there. They've been told they're going to go to Israel. The people, the 2 million in Gaza, they had they're not they're not fighting for an independent state. They're not struggling for an independent state. They have one in Gaza. If Hamas would have been nonviolent, they'd be there's nobody, there's no Israeli troops, no nothing. So you have to deal with the issue that this has been going on because these 2.5 million people sitting in Gaza, the couple of 100,000 in Lebanon, people in Jordan, they're not, they've been told that they can go back to Israel proper. And you're going to be a refugee until you can.
it does that how Uh, does that is that so out there? Is that so terrible for people whose ancestors were moved, pushed out of a certain land to want to return to that land when any Jew from anywhere in the world can literally just live where they are? Someone from Brooklyn, someone from New York, someone from Russia, any Jew from any part of the world can literally live there and go to Israel and have citizenship. Someone who's never been to Israel can go to Israel
That's
and
exactly
get
right.
citizenship,
I
and
can
then
go there.
someone who's oh, you're Jewish, so you could go to Israel now and get citizenship,
Exactly.
but someone
Exactly.
whose grandparents were kicked off their homes in
Well, it's now
1948 or
getting to
after
be
that
their great grandparents.
can't can't go back to that land. It just seems
Yeah, but they have no real tie. As I said, these were landless peasants. These were landless peasants, and in Israel proper, they might have been there for 2 generations. So it isn't like there were these really strong ties or family traditions. They could go to the they could go to the West Bank. How do they know the difference? They're not going back to their village. It's one thing if they say we're from this village and that's our roots and we want to go there. It's just not. They don't want to
but
go.
there were homes that they were kicked out from, like,
I understand, but where their grandparents and great grandparents were kicked out,
yeah,
and
where the
people
grandparents
have
and great
homes a lot of
grandparents were.
places. But again,
But
it
the unique problem with this is his Jewish claim to that land is on an historical basis. Our We had a kingdom here 2,000 years ago, and
exactly.
who do you think has a stronger tie to a place? Someone whose ancestors have not been there for 2,000 years, or someone's
But
ancestors whose ancestors were there
you're
two
not being
hundred years ago?
realistic here. You're not being realistic. You have a younger generation of Palestinians who are 3 generations removed from anybody living in Israel proper. They have no, sure, there may be a few families, but the vast majority have no ancestral memory of a meaningful. They were living in hovels. They weren't living in palaces. They were living in these dilapidated, poor like Jews were living in the Russia in these shtetls. Jews didn't have a longing to go back to shtetls. Now, if they were living in Warsaw in a fancy house and so on, maybe, but they weren't going back to shtetls. They didn't have, and they lived there for generations upon generation. They glad to get out of there. And it's the same thing with landless peasants living in dilapidated rural villages. They're not wanting to go back to that. They're glad to be away from that. So you can build up some fantasy world in which there is this major loss that the Palestinians have. But again, it's like the Jews, did they have a major loss of not living in shtetls anymore or not living in slums in one place or another? They don't have sentimental value for that. So you certainly had wealthy Palestinians. You had you had people who were substantial, and they may have those feelings. But for the vast, vast majority of Palestinians, they're coming from a population that has no interest to reliving the poverty and problems they had when they lived in these dilapidated villages, in these hovels of homes.
So,
That's what I'm going to leave it on. we're
yeah. So,
not we're not going to
last
agree.
last point, last point before we end the conversation. I just wanted us to maybe talk a little bit more on this idea that Arabs didn't have land and all that. So I'm going to read
No, they did.
from.
Arabs had land. Wasn't they didn't? But I'm saying the majority of Arabs didn't. That's the difference. Certainly there was, and it was confiscated in fairly horrible ways after the war. I can go into stories where if you move from village A to village B that was 10 miles away and you were still in Israel proper, because you moved 10 miles away during the war, the government was able to confiscate your land. I mean, they were brutal, but I'm just saying for at least half of the population, they weren't landowners. They were agricultural laborers living in these horrible villages. So you don't want to be sentimental about that.
Okay. So what gives someone, a Jew like you, in the United States, you are a US citizen, you are not an Israeli citizen. What gives you the right to the land of Israel? What's
Well,
the
the whole
connection to that
history,
land?
there's this whole history of anti Semitism, which you see a lot of it now, this kind of outpouring where people have had never had any interest in the Palestinian issue, have no, all of a sudden, the kind of viciousness towards Jews, not just Zionists, to Jews, has led, for historic reasons, for many Jews to believe they have to have a homeland where any Jew in the world who is subject to the potential anti Semitism that has been historic, they have to have a place to go. And it was necessary for the Mizrahi Jews, for Ethiopian Jews, for Jews who've been oppressed where they live. There needed a place to be. And it's unfortunate that there were some other people there at the time who were unwilling to share, even modestly, the land, even modestly, as I mentioned with the Peel Commission. But we're where we are today, and we have to find a way for those descendants of refugees to move on with their lives. That's what we have to find ways, and there's a lot of international money that will help that. But this idea that they have this longing to go back, and we have to allow them, their great grandchildren, to go back to some mystical land that they came from, is just not dealing with the reality is that as many refugees have, they have to be helped to begin creating new lives. And that's what the focus should be on, is what's going to help these people living for intergenerationally in these refugee camps with no hope of anything except this aspiration that at some point they'll be able to go back to Israel. And we won't let them migrate. So, for example, if the United States said, we're going to take in 50,000 Gazans, you think there wouldn't be 50,000 Gazans who jump at the chance to come to the U.S.? No, that's ethnic cleansing. You're not allowed to do that. You're
Yeah,
taking them
but
away from
under
Gaza.
international law, you're not allowed to do that.
Well, not allowed to do what? If voluntarily, if people say, I'm willing to go,
You're not. It's part of the definition of genocide to take that large amount of people for political reasons out of a place. They're not just leaving because they want to leave. They're leaving because there's a political situation on the ground.
they're leaving because it was never good for them. They would have they were leaving to work in Qatar before, 1991. There were tens of thousands of Palestinians work. But the idea that you're telling me that if 50,000 people from Gaza voluntarily wanted to come to the United States, that would be genocide. You got to think about that for a minute. You got to think
It's not.
about
It's not me. It's part of the definition that any attempt to
what kind of
remove
definition is if you
any
take
attempts to remove a group of
it's
people.
not removed, it's voluntarily. It's
Well, if they
saying
want to leave
we're willing to
voluntarily, they
accept
can.
refugees. We're willing to accept refugees.
If they wanted to leave voluntarily, they can.
They can't.
They can.
They can't. Every everyone has been told you can't take in refugees. They are they're Gazans and you take them in. Really, no country has made an offer because they're not allowed to, given the politics now.
Why are they not allowed to? Who's stopping them? Who's stopping any country from doing that?
Who is stopping them? It's the Palestinian move leadership in is
The
not allowed.
Palestinians were literally begging for Egypt to open up its borders so people can leave, or
And if
for
they did,
Israel to
oh,
lift.
the Palestinians were the people, not the leadership. The people. You have to
Okay.
distinguish, and the leadership is control over has control over what the UN says.
Mm.
The UN is so committed, right? They have this whole infrastructure in Gaza, right? They got their schools, their hospitals. There's a whole infrastructure that is formulated on the basis of serving a refugee population. And that's what's, of course, the Gazans want to get out, and they would have wanted to get out before. That's not ethnic cleansing to
I,
let
I think
people out.
I think it's
Ethnic cleansing,
terrible if they
how
want
does
to
this have
leave.
anything to do with happen where you had it where you have even if let's say 50,000 people went out, that's 2% of the population. How is that ethnic cleansing?
So
You know,
I
it's
think
an
it's
abuse of the
terrible.
term ethnic cleansing to talk
I think it's
about a marginal number of people, even if it was 20%. How is that ethnic cleansing? So if Gaza, instead of having 2.5 million people, had 2 million people or had 1.5 million, that's ethnic cleansing?
not my
Really?
definition. Not my
Well, I don't
definition.
know. Who
Not
defines
my
it?
not
Wait,
by definition.
who defines ethnic cleansing? There's
So
no
so
definition. It's
my
like a
my my,
made up. It's a
my
made up
point
definition.
my point really is, if the Gazans want to leave, I think they should be allowed to leave. If they are leaving voluntarily, that's fine. But people don't just leave their homes. There's usually a compelling reason for them to
Yeah,
want to
there's a
leave.
war. There's
Yeah, and
destruction.
yes. So,
Why did people leave Syria? Why do you have Syrian refugees in Europe?
true,
Because there's a war, or you have them when you have a brutal dictator. People want to leave a
true,
dictatorship. So you
true.
think people didn't want to leave Gaza under Hamas? You
Of
think,
course, people want to leave.
but nobody would take them because it wasn't open to. So anyway, look, we've been talking for an hour and a half, and I'm glad we had this conversation and edit it down to 35 minutes.
All right, Professor Sherry,
It's always
I
good
just
talking to you.
I just want to say I really appreciate talking with you. But my last point to you before you leave would be that I understand the need for the formation of the state of Israel, given or I understand the need for Jews to have
To
a
have a
place
place.
where they
Yes,
can feel safe, right? I understand that need and I support that need. Where I take issues with with the Zionist project is that in trying to solve a problem, another problem was created, right?
I agree.
Somehow the
I
Jews
agree.
got what they wanted at the expense of another people, and it doesn't just sit too well with me. When you were talking about, there was a point where you summarized brilliantly the need for a Jewish state. And if you just remove Jew and put Palestinian in that situation, it will almost seem like it's applicable to the Palestinians because these are people who are looking for they are looking to return to quote and unquote and a homeland, right? You could call it mythical, just as some people would say, "Oh, Jewish claims to the land is mythical and all that." They are looking to returning to their homeland. They are not allowed. They are not allowed to become citizens of other countries, just as Jews for centuries were not allowed to become full citizens of the countries they were in. Right? They were discriminated against in France, in Germany, in England, and all that. Same as the Palestinians now, they are not allowed to become Jordanians or Saudis or Lebanese or Egyptians. So they're just stuck in this state of limbo. So I think that I think both sides, I think both sides are actually contributing to the problem. I believe that if initially the Arabs had if they had accepted the partition plan, I think wouldn't be in this mess right now. And I think over the years, if Israeli policies have been less less draconian, probably they would have been a solution as well. So I think, of course, Israel isn't going anywhere. Israel isn't going anywhere as a state, but neither are the Palestinians. So I think both sides need to find a way to just live together. Um, that's my
Let's hope.
final.
Let's hope.
That's not my final summation. Thank you very much,
Well,
Professor
thank you.
Sherry. It
Okay.
was a pleasure talking with you. I really, really appreciate, and I do hope you would be willing to come back for us to have other conversations. Not not
Well,
necessarily
I'm
about
actually in
Israeli
the middle of a
Palestinians.
book. I'm in the middle of a book on the history and dynamics of the Arab citizens of Israel.
Mm,
Because, as you mentioned, I think it's quite important that within Israel proper, their treatment of their Arab minority has been pretty positive in the last 20 years. And, that's not inconsequential. So it's not, anyway. So when I'm through with this book, I'll get you a copy and we can talk.
that would be lovely. That would be lovely.
Okay. Take
Thank
care.
you very much, Professor Sherry.
Bye.
Thank. Bye.